November 8th, 1952, 2:47 a.m. The knock wasn't loud, just 3 measured taps on Tony Bennett's apartment door in Manhattan. When Tony opened it, Frank Sinatra was standing in the hallway. His hair was falling across his forehead. His tie hung loose and crooked. He was holding a bottle of Jack Daniels, about 2/3 empty, and his eyes looked like he'd been crying or drinking for hours, maybe both. Tony didn't ask what happened. He just stepped aside and held the door open. Frank walked in without speaking and sat down heavily on the couch. Neither man said anything for almost 10 minutes. To understand why Frank Sinatra was standing at Tony Bennett's door at 3 in the morning with nowhere else to go, you need to understand where Frank was in November 1952. 3 knocks on the door of a small Manhattan apartment. Tony Bennett opened it and found Frank Sinatra standing in the hallway, hair disheveled, tie hanging loose, eyes red from crying or drinking or both. Frank was holding a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels and could barely get the words out. "Tony, I didn't know where else to go." This was the night the most powerful man in entertainment had lost everything, and only one person in the world was willing to let him in. The knock came at 2:47 in the morning. Tony Bennett had been asleep for maybe an hour, finally drifting off after a late recording session at Columbia Studios that had run until well past midnight. The sound wasn't loud or urgent, just 3 measured raps on the door of his small apartment on West 52nd Street in Manhattan. But something about the timing, the lateness of the hour, made his eyes snap open immediately. For a moment, he considered not answering. Nothing good came from knocks at 3 in the morning. But the sound came again. 3 more knocks, patient but insistent, and Tony pushed himself out of bed, pulled on a robe, and walked barefoot across the cold hardwood floor to the door. When he opened it, Frank Sinatra was standing in the hallway. Not the Frank Sinatra who commanded stages and dominated Billboard charts. Not the swaggering voice who'd made Bobby Soxers faint and built a career on being the coolest cat in any room. This was someone else entirely. Frank's hair was disheveled, his tie pulled loose and hanging at odd angles. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from drinking or crying or both. Tony couldn't tell. He held a bottle of Jack Daniels in his left hand, about 2/3 empty. "Tony," Frank said quietly. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Tony didn't ask questions. He stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in." This was November 1952, and Frank Sinatra's career wasn't just struggling, it was dying in front of the entire entertainment industry. The decline had been swift and brutal, the kind of fall that happens when everything goes wrong at once, and momentum becomes impossible to stop. Columbia Records had dropped him 6 months earlier, declining to renew his contract after years of declining sales. His television show on CBS had been canceled. MGM had let his movie contract lapse. His voice, once the instrument that defined popular music, had been damaged by a hemorrhage of his vocal cords during a performance at the Copacabana. He could still sing, but the effortless quality that had made him special was gone, replaced by a strained sound that made audiences uncomfortable. Worse than the professional failures were the personal ones. His marriage to Nancy had ended in a messy public divorce that painted him as the villain. His relationship with Ava Gardner, the one thing he'd sacrificed everything else to pursue, was falling apart spectacularly. Ava was in Africa filming Mogambo, and the distance between them had revealed how little substance held them together. The industry that had built Frank Sinatra up had turned on him with the viciousness of a pack of wolves. Columnists who'd once praised him now wrote gleeful obituaries of his career. Club owners who'd begged him to perform suddenly had no available dates. Other performers, sensing weakness, distanced themselves. Nobody wanted to be associated with failure, especially failure as public and complete as Frank's. But Tony Bennett wasn't like the others. He remembered 1949, when he was nobody, just another Italian kid from Queens trying to break into an impossible business. Frank had seen him perform at a small club in Greenwich Village and had been impressed enough to mention Tony's name to Mitch Miller at Columbia Records. That mention had led to Tony's first recording contract, which had led to Because of You, which had led to everything else. Tony had never forgotten that kindness, and he wasn't going to forget it now, when Frank needed someone to remember. Frank walked into the apartment without speaking, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd been drinking steadily, but wasn't quite drunk yet. He looked around the small space. One bedroom, a tiny living room, barely bigger than a decent hotel suite, and something in his expression shifted. "This is nice," Frank said. "Cozy." Tony closed the door and locked it. "It's small, but it's home. Sit down, Frank. You want some coffee?" "I got coffee." Frank held up the bottle of Jack Daniels. "That's not coffee." "It's better than coffee." Frank sat down heavily on the couch and looked at Tony with eyes that had seen too much lately and understood too little. "You know what happened today?" Tony sat down in the chair across from him. "No, what happened?" "I went to see Bob Whiteman at the Paramount." "You know Bob, right? Ran the theater for years. I played there dozens of times. Made him millions of dollars." Frank's voice was bitter. "I went to ask if he had any dates available. Any dates at all. You know what he said?" Tony waited. "He said he'd have to check with his bookers." "Have to check with his bookers. Like I'm some nobody off the street." Frank took a long drink from the bottle. 20 years ago, I couldn't walk down Broadway without causing a riot. Girls screaming, cops having to control crowds. And now Bob Whiteman has to check with his fucking bookers. Frank. And you know what the worst part is? Frank's voice cracked slightly. He wasn't being mean. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just being honest. I'm not a draw anymore, Tony. I'm poison. Nobody wants me. Tony had heard the rumors. Of course, everyone in the business had. Frank Sinatra was finished, washed up at 36, a cautionary tale about what happens when you get too big, too fast, and burn too bright. But hearing Frank say it himself, hearing the defeat in his voice, was different. "That's not true," Tony said quietly. Frank laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You're a terrible liar, kid. It's one of the things I like about you." He took another drink. "Ava called me yesterday from Africa. You know what she said? She said maybe we should take a break. A break, like we're a couple of teenagers who need some space to figure things out. I'm sorry, Frank. I left Nancy for her. I destroyed my family for her. I let the whole world call me a home wrecker and a bastard because I thought..." Frank stopped, his voice catching. "I thought she was worth it. I thought what we had was real." Tony didn't know what to say. He'd never been married, never experienced that kind of consuming passion that makes you willing to sacrifice everything else. But he could see the pain in Frank's face, raw and unguarded in a way Frank Sinatra never allowed himself to be in public. "You got any glasses in this place?" Frank asked. "I'm tired of drinking from the bottle like a bum." Tony got up and went to the small kitchen. He found 2 tumblers, brought them back, and set them on the coffee table. Frank poured generously, filling both glasses nearly to the rim. To having nowhere else to go, Frank said, raising his glass. They drank in silence for a while. The apartment was quiet. except for the occasional sound of traffic from the street below and the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Tony watched Frank carefully, noting the way his hands shook slightly when he poured another drink, the way his eyes kept drifting to the window as if looking for something that wasn't there. "You know what kills me?" Frank said eventually. "It's not the career stuff. I mean, yeah, it hurts, but I always knew that could go away. One day you're hot, the next day you're not. That's show business." He took a drink. "But the people, Tony. The way people look at me now, like I'm pathetic, like I'm something to feel sorry for. People are stupid," Tony said. "They forget that talent doesn't just disappear. You're still Frank Sinatra." "Am I?" Frank looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Because lately I'm not sure who that is anymore. When I was with Nancy, I knew who I was. I was the husband, the father, the provider. When I was on top of the charts, I knew who I was. I was the voice, the star, the guy everybody wanted. But now," he gestured vaguely with his glass sloshing whiskey. Tony leaned forward. "You're a singer, one of the best singers who ever lived. That doesn't change just because you're going through a rough patch." "A rough patch?" Frank laughed bitterly. "That's a nice way of putting it. My voice is shot, Tony. I can barely make it through a ballad without sounding like I'm strangling. You know what that's like? To have the one thing you're good at, the one thing that made you special, just taken away from you?" "The hemorrhage was temporary," Tony said. "The doctors said your voice will come back." "When? Next year? 5 years? 10? Frank's voice rose. "By the time it comes back, if it comes back, everyone will have forgotten who I was. They'll have moved on to whoever's hot right now. Hell, they've already moved on. You seen the charts lately? It's all Patti Page and Rosemary Clooney, and..." He stopped himself. "No offense to them. They're talented, but they're not. They're not you," Tony finished. "Yeah." Frank slumped back against the couch. "They're not me. And the thing is, I don't know if the world wants me anymore anyway. Even if my voice comes back perfect tomorrow, even if I could sing like I did in 45, I don't know if anyone would care." They sat in silence again. The clock on the mantel showed it was past 3:30. Tony knew he should probably encourage Frank to go home, get some sleep, face things fresh in the morning. But he also knew that Frank hadn't come here looking for advice or encouragement. He'd come looking for something simpler and harder to find. Someone who would sit with him in his worst moment and not judge him for it. "You remember that night at the Village Vanguard?" Frank asked suddenly. "Must have been 49, maybe 50. You were singing there, and I came in with a couple of guys from the label." Tony remembered. "You told me I had something special. Said I reminded you of yourself when you were starting out." "You did. You do." Frank looked at him. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Tony." "What?" "You stayed humble. You didn't let the success go to your head. You didn't blow up your life chasing after some fantasy." Frank's voice was thick now, whether from emotion or alcohol. "You were smart enough to keep your feet on the ground. I just didn't have as far to fall," Tony said quietly. Frank smiled. The first genuine smile Tony had seen from him all night. "Maybe, or maybe you're just a better man than I am." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Frank stood up, swaying slightly, and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark street below. "I destroyed everything, Tony. My marriage, my family, my career. And for what? For a woman who's taking a break from me. For a voice that's abandoning me. For a public that never really loved me. They just loved the image of me." Tony stood up and walked over to stand next to him. "You didn't destroy everything. You're still here. You can rebuild. Frank turned to look at him. His eyes were wet now, tears he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. You really believe that? Yes. Why? Because I've heard you sing, Tony said simply. And talent like that doesn't just disappear. It might take time to come back. It might take work, but it's still there inside you. You just have to be patient. Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm not good at being patient. I know. They stood there at the window for a long moment. Two men looking out at a sleeping city that had chewed one of them up and was still deciding what to do with the other. Thank you, Frank said quietly, for letting me in, for not asking a bunch of questions or trying to fix everything, for just, he paused, searching for words, for just being here. You'd do the same for me, Tony said. Would I? Frank looked at him. I don't know if I would. I like to think I would, but honestly, I don't know. I've been so caught up in my own problems for so long that I'm not sure I'd notice if someone else needed help. You noticed me back in '49. That was different. That was business. This is, Frank gestured vaguely. This is just being a decent human being, and I'm not sure I've been that in a long time. Tony put his hand on Frank's shoulder. You're being too hard on yourself. Am I? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. I left my kids, Tony. I walked away from my 3 children because I was chasing after something I thought would make me happy. What kind of man does that? A man who made a mistake, Tony said. A man who's human. Frank closed his eyes. When he opened them again, some of the pain had receded, replaced by exhaustion. I should go. It's late, and you probably have things to do tomorrow. Stay, Tony said. The couch pulls out. Get some sleep. We'll have breakfast in the morning. Frank looked like he was going to argue, but then he just nodded. Tony found sheets and a blanket, helped Frank make up the couch. Frank sat down heavily, still holding the nearly empty bottle of Jack Daniels. You're a good friend, Tony, Frank said. Better than I deserve. Get some sleep, Frank. Tony went back to his bedroom, but didn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the sounds from the living room. Frank moving around restlessly, the clink of the bottle against the coffee table, eventually the sound of rough breathing that meant Frank had finally passed out. When Tony woke up the next morning, Frank was gone. The sheets were neatly folded on the couch. The whiskey bottle sat empty on the coffee table, next to a handwritten note on a piece of paper, torn from Tony's notepad. Thanks for last night. I won't forget it. Tony never told anyone about that night. Not the press, not his manager, not even close friends. It was a private moment between 2 men, one of whom had nowhere else to go, and the other who'd opened his door without hesitation. Frank's career did eventually recover. It took time, another year of struggling, of small clubs and rejection, before he landed the role in From Here to Eternity that would resurrect everything. But when it happened, when Frank came roaring back bigger than ever, he remembered the people who'd stood by him when he had nothing. Tony would get phone calls at odd hours. Frank checking in, seeing how he was doing, asking if he needed anything. Invitations to parties, introductions to important people, opportunities that materialized because Frank Sinatra had made a phone call on his behalf. But neither of them ever mentioned November 1952. They didn't need to. Some debts don't require acknowledgement because they run deeper than words can express. Years later, a reporter asked Frank about his friendship with Tony Bennett. Frank thought about it for a moment, then said, Tony's the kind of guy who'd open his door at 3 in the morning and not ask why you're there. That's rarer than you think. That was all he ever said about it publicly. But it was enough.